Okay, so you've given us a ton of material to work with this time around. It seems like it's all focused on making sure clinical trials are actually, trustworthy.
Yeah, it really is. It's all about the foundation, the stuff that makes clinical research reliable and ethical
Yeah.
and, of course, compliant with all the rules.
Exactly. So we're going to do a deep dive on data integrity, which I think is pretty self-explanatory, right? We need good data, and then informed consent, making sure people are actually choosing to be part of these
Right,
trials.
and knowing what they're getting into.
And then all the record keeping because, well, if it's not written down, it didn't happen, right?
It's like the old saying, if a tree falls in the forest.
Uh-huh. Exactly. And we're looking at all of this through the lens of current good clinical practice at CGCP for those who are in the know.
Right. And you've given us a really interesting mix of stuff to work with, from transcripts of actual discussions to the nitty-gritty details in the regulations themselves, like CFR Title 21.
Yeah, like parts 11, 211, 312, a whole bunch. Plus some industry guidance to round things out.
Exactly.
So what we're trying to do here is kind of distill it all down. What are the big ideas? What are the things that people on the ground actually doing this work need to know?
It's like a cheat sheet for ethical and reliable clinical research.
I like that. All right, let's jump in. Data integrity. Let's start there.
Okay, so data integrity, if the data's bad, the whole trial's bad. Kind of obvious, but
Garbage in, garbage out, right?
yeah, exactly. And it's not just about accuracy. The data has to be precise too.
Hmm, interesting.
Yeah, one of the transcripts, the one from EA's consulting group, really emphasized that. And they talked about the need for systems, like processes and checks and balances to make sure the data is controlled and reviewed every step of the way.
Which makes sense. It can't just be like, one person entering numbers into a spreadsheet.
Right, that EAS transcript, they talk about this multi-stage review process. So first you have the analyst reviewing the data.
Makes sense.
Then it goes to peer review. So other people who understand the data, they take a look.
More eyes.
Exactly. And then it goes up to the supervisor. And they might even have quality assurance get involved too.
Wow, so multiple layers of people looking at the data.
Yeah. And it's not just about catching mistakes. It's about having different perspectives. Someone might pick up on something that someone else missed, like a bias or data that doesn't quite fit with what they know about the study.
Right, like one person might focus on the statistics while another one is thinking more about the clinical picture.
Exactly.
And speaking of keeping things secure, one thing that stuck out to me from that EAS transcript was their example of non-prescription dietary supplements. They have to keep data on serious adverse events for at least 6 years.
Right.
That's way longer than the usual data retention requirements you find in 21 CFR Part 111. Why is that?
Well, it kind of gets to the heart of risk, right? With those supplements, people are taking them without a doctor overseeing things. So the regulators want to see long-term safety data, just in case there are any issues that pop up down the line. It's like better safe than sorry.
That makes sense. So it really underscores how important it is to be on top of the specific regulations that apply to your work. I mean, it can vary depending on what you're researching.
Absolutely. And, this whole idea of long-term data retention, it's connected to something else we saw in the source material, source documentation.
Oh, yeah. The FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course transcript talked about that. But can you remind us what exactly source documentation means? I think it's easy to forget.
Basically, source documentation is the original proof, like the actual firsthand records of everything that happened in the trial. The lab results, the doctor's notes, the hospital charts, any observations is the raw data, straight from the source.
Okay, I see. So not just summaries or data that's been processed.
Right. And the FDA, they're super clear that being able to verify the data against those original sources is like non-negotiable. It's how you know for sure that the study is accurate and trustworthy. If you can't trace the data back to its origin, there's always going to be that question mark.
So it's all about traceability, making sure there's a clear, unbroken line back to the original information.
Exactly.
Now, another concept that came up, though not always with the exact same term, was audit trails.
Ah, yes.
And I think this was more implied than explicitly stated in a lot of the discussions about data control and review, but the idea is definitely there.
Oh, absolutely. Especially with all the electronic data we use these days. Think of an audit trail as a digital paper trail. It's the system that tracks every change made to the data. Who made the change, when they made it, what they changed, why they changed it. It's all recorded.
So, like a history of the data.
Yes, exactly. And that creates another layer of transparency and accountability. You can see exactly what happened to the data, which is really important for identifying any potential problems.
And I guess this also helps when the data goes to regulatory agencies for review.
Oh, absolutely. The FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course transcript made that very clear. They need to be confident that the data is reliable.
Right, and if that data integrity is missing, things can go south pretty quickly.
Yeah, for sure. The OSIS Workshop 2022 transcript touched on this. They talked about what can happen if documentation goes missing, especially documentation about who was eligible to be in the study in the first place.
Right, like if someone shouldn't have been included in the trial.
Exactly. And if you can't prove that everyone in the trial met the criteria, it throws the whole data set into question.
Huh.
And that's not just a scientific issue, it's an ethical one, too. It means you might have put people at risk without their fully informed consent.
Okay, so data integrity is super important. But let's switch gears now and talk about informed consent.
Yeah, let's do that.
Because this is all about the ethics of clinical research, right? Making
Right.
sure people are participating willingly and knowingly.
Absolutely. And the FDA takes this really seriously. The FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course transcript emphasized that verifying the informed consent process is a major focus of inspections. They want to see that it was done properly and that the institutional review boards, the IRBs, provided proper oversight.
Right. The IRBs are there to protect the participants' rights and well-being.
Exactly.
Now, the basic idea of informed consent, making sure people understand and agree to be in the trial, it seems pretty straightforward. But I get the sense that in practice, it can be a lot more complicated.
Oh, yeah, it definitely can be. The CHIOS Lunch and Learn transcript brought up this really interesting scenario where research nurses were going to participants' homes to obtain consent.
Oh, wow. That adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right, like if you're in a home setting, you might not have all the resources you'd normally have in a clinic or hospital, so how do you document everything properly? The CHIOS transcript offered some really good advice. Have a clear standard operating procedure, or SOP.
Ah, so everyone knows what to do, even in those trickier situations.
Exactly. And make sure that SOP is reviewed and approved by quality assurance. That way, if there's ever an audit, you can show that you had a system in place and that it was designed to meet all the requirements.
Okay, so planning ahead and having a documented process is key.
Absolutely.
Now, there was also this really interesting tidbit in that CHIOS transcript about the preferred color of ink for documentation,
Oh yeah, blue ink.
right? They mentioned that blue ink is often preferred over black ink, even though both are usually acceptable.
Yeah, it's a small detail, but it shows how much attention to detail is important in this field. Apparently, blue ink can sometimes make it easier to distinguish an original document from a photocopy.
Okay, so it helps with clarity and prevents any confusion.
Exactly.
And getting back to the serious side of informed consent, the OSIS Workshop 2022 transcript really highlighted the problems that can arise if those consent documents are missing.
Oh yeah, that's a big deal. If there's no signed consent form, it's a huge red flag. It basically means you can't prove that the participant understood the study, the risks, the potential benefits, and that they freely chose to be part of it.
It undermines the entire ethical foundation of the trial.
Exactly. It raises serious questions about whether the research was conducted ethically and whether the participants' rights were protected.
Okay, so we've talked about making sure the data is sound and making sure people are participating with full understanding and consent. But now let's get into how all of this is documented and preserved. Record keeping. This seems like the glue that holds everything together.
It really is. And there's a principle that came up over and over again in your sources. It's almost like a golden rule of CGCP.
Oh, what is it?
If it wasn't documented, it wasn't done.
Simple but powerful.
Right. We saw it in the Season 4, Season 6, and Season 5 transcripts. And it really drives home the importance of thorough and accurate record keeping. If you can't provide documentation, it's like it never happened.
And the regulators won't be happy about that.
Definitely not. And your sources gave some very specific examples of what needs to be recorded, like Section 211.166 that requires complete records of all stability testing.
Right, stability testing. That's all about figuring out how long a drug product remains safe and effective and how it needs to be stored.
Exactly. And those records are crucial because they prove that the testing was done correctly and that the product meets the required standards.
And it's not just about documenting the results, right? It's about documenting the entire process.
Absolutely. Section 211.122 is a good example of that. It requires written procedures for everything related to labeling and packaging materials, how they're received, identified, stored, handled, sampled, examined, tested. Every single step needs to be spelled out.
And then you also need to document that you actually follow those procedures, right?
Right. That usually happens in the batch production records. Establishing a CGMP laboratory audit system, the document by Bleisner, emphasized this. You need to show that you examined the packaging and labeling materials to make sure they're correct and suitable before you use them.
So it's like a double layer of documentation. You have the procedure itself, and then you have the record showing that you followed it.
Exactly. And then you have distribution records, too. Section 211.196 requires those.
Yeah.
They need to include things like the name of the product, its strength, the dosage form, the consignee, the date, the quantity shipped, all the key details.
That makes sense. It's all about traceability. If something goes wrong, you need to be able to track that product back to its origin.
Exactly. And then there are complaints.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, complaints happen. And Section 211.198 requires you to have written procedures for handling all complaints about a drug product, whether they're written or verbal.
So a system for dealing with those complaints.
Right. And those procedures have to include a review by the Quality Control Unit. They need to decide whether a full investigation is needed. And there needs to be a way to figure out if the complaint is actually reporting a serious and unexpected adverse drug experience. Because if it is, that needs to be reported to the FDA right away.
Okay, so complaints can trigger a whole chain of events.
They can, which is why those procedures are so important. And then we have reserve samples.
Reserve samples, what are those?
Basically, they're samples of the product that you keep on hand, like a backup.
Okay, I see.
And there are specific rules about them. Section 111.83 and Section 211.170 lay out those rules. The samples have to be properly identified with the batch or lot number. They need to be stored for a specific amount of time, usually 1 year after the product's shelf life expires or 2 years from the date of distribution. And you need to have enough of the sample to perform all the necessary tests.
So if there's ever a question about the quality of a product, you have these samples to go back to.
Exactly. They're like an insurance policy.
And it seems like every step of the process needs to be documented, even when things go wrong.
Oh, absolutely. Section 111.90 talks about deviations and unanticipated occurrences. If something happens that's not part of the standard procedure, you need to document it.
Like if there's an equipment malfunction or a mistake is made.
Exactly. And you need to document why it happened and what you did to correct it. Transparency is key.
And what about electronic records and signatures?
Ah, yes. That's where 21 CFR Part 11 comes in.
Okay, Part 11. That's all about the rules for using electronic systems instead of paper records.
Right. You can use electronic records and electronic signatures, but you have to make sure you meet all the requirements of Part 11, like making sure the systems are validated, having those audit trails we talked about, and implementing security measures to protect the integrity of the data.
So it's not just a free-for-all. There are rules in place to make sure electronic systems are just as reliable as paper records.
Exactly.
And finally, even the equipment itself needs to be documented, right?
That's right. Section 211.68 requires you to keep written records of all the calibration checks and inspections of automatic, mechanical, and electronic equipment.
So proving that the equipment is working correctly.
Exactly. Regular calibration and inspection and documenting it all is essential for making sure the equipment is operating accurately and reliably, which is really important for producing high-quality products.
Okay, so we've talked about data integrity, informed consent, and record keeping as separate pieces, but it's clear that they're all connected, right?
Oh, absolutely. They're all intertwined. You can't have strong data integrity without meticulous record keeping. The documentation of informed consent is itself a critical record. And all of these areas are scrutinized very carefully during FDA inspections. The FDA Clinical Investigator Training Course transcript made that very clear.
Right, and that transcript actually spelled out what the FDA focuses on during those inspections. They want to see that the study is being conducted according to the approved plan, that informed consent was obtained properly, that the data is accurate and verifiable, and that the investigational drug is being controlled appropriately.
Yeah. And they also mentioned that the most common observations they make during inspections are related to these very areas, like problems with sticking to the study plan, issues with source documentation, deficiencies in the informed consent process, and inadequate procedures.
So these are the areas where people tend to slip up.
It seems that way.
And it all comes back to the big picture of CGMP, right?
Absolutely. The Devon Edwards video transcript talked about this. CGMP is all about ensuring consistent quality, protecting patients, and making sure everyone is following the rules.
It's about doing things the right way for the right reasons.
Exactly.
So to wrap this all up, let's recap the key takeaways. Data integrity It's not just about having the right numbers. It's about having systems and processes in place to ensure accuracy, precision, and reliability. And it requires ongoing review and careful attention to detail throughout the entire data lifecycle.
Right. And informed consent, it's not just a signature on a form. It's a fundamental ethical and regulatory requirement. You need to have well-defined processes to make sure participants are truly informed and that their consent is documented properly.
And then, of course, record keeping. The golden rule is if it wasn't documented, it wasn't done. Thorough record keeping is essential for demonstrating compliance and proving that you've conducted the trial ethically and responsibly.
It's the backbone of trustworthy clinical research.
Exactly.
And this all makes me think, with clinical trials becoming more complex and more global, what are the new ways we can strengthen data integrity and streamline informed consent while still maintaining those ethical standards? And how can we make record keeping more efficient without sacrificing accuracy or completeness?
That's a great question to ponder. And for those who want to dig deeper into all of this, I definitely recommend checking out the regulations we mentioned, 21 CFR Parts 11, 111, 211, and 312. And the GMP guidelines are a great resource too. Mastering these principles is essential for anyone involved in clinical research.
It's how we ensure that new medical products are safe and effective.
Exactly. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us. It's been enlightening.
It really has. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. Until next time.